She had learned, over 7 decades of living, that some of the most important gifts are the ones you never mention giving. Dorothy Camden was 74 years old, and she had been a quilter for 56 of those years. She'd started at 18, taught by her own grandmother in a farmhouse kitchen in rural Vermont, learning to transform scraps into something whole, something useful, something that told a story if you knew how to read it. Now she lived in a small ranch house in a quiet neighborhood outside Portland, Oregon, where the rain came soft and steady through 9 months of the year, and the roses grew so enthusiastically they required constant pruning. Her quilting room occupied what had once been the third bedroom, the one her youngest son had used before college, before marriage, before he'd moved to Boston and started calling once a month instead of once a week. The room faced east. Morning light came through sheer curtains and fell across her work table in golden rectangles that shifted with the seasons. She knew those patterns intimately, knew which months the light reached the far corner, knew when it started retreating again, pulling back toward winter. This particular morning in late October, Dorothy sat at her table with a cup of coffee cooling beside her and a letter in her hands. She'd read it 3 times already, but she read it again, slowly, letting the words settle into understanding. The letter was from her daughter-in-law, Christina, married to her son Michael for 12 years now, mother of Dorothy's only grandchildren, Emma, age 10, and Joshua, age 7. The letter was carefully worded, polite, apologetic even, but the message underneath the politeness was clear. Dorothy's Christmas visit would need to be shorter this year, maybe just Christmas Day itself rather than the full week she usually spent with them. Christina explained about scheduling conflicts, about the kids' activities, about Michael's work demands. Everything was so busy, they hoped Dorothy understood. Dorothy set the letter down and picked up her coffee. It had gone cold, but she drank it anyway, looking out the window at her neighbor's Japanese maple losing its leaves in slow motion, one scarlet flutter at a time. She understood perfectly. She just wasn't sure what she understood yet. Dorothy had been making Christmas quilts for her grandchildren since Emma was born, 1 quilt per child per year, designed specifically for them. She'd keep notes throughout the year, things they mentioned liking, colors they gravitated toward, interests that captured their attention. Then she'd design a quilt that reflected who they were at that particular age. Last year, Emma's quilt featured books and glassies and tiny embroidered quotes from her favorite novels. Joshua's had been all about baseball, his new obsession. Dorothy had collected fabric with tiny baseball bats and mitts, found the perfect navy blue for a background that would suggest a night game under stadium lights. Both quilts were about halfway finished. The tops were pieced. She'd just started the actual quilting, the process of stitching through all 3 layers that would take another 20 hours per quilt. She looked at Emma's quilt spread across her work table. Orion's belt picked out in silver thread, Andromeda's chains rendered in delicate gray. All that mythology, all those stories of gods and mortals and consequences. Dorothy had learned something about consequences over her 74 years. They rarely arrived the way you expected. She didn't call Michael immediately. That wasn't her way. Instead, she sat with the letter for several days, letting it turn over in her mind while she worked on the quilts. Her hands knew the rhythm, needle in, pull through, needle in, pull through, well enough that her mind could wander. She thought about Christmases past, the first year Emma was born, how Dorothy had held her granddaughter and felt that fierce, unexpected love that grandparents discover, the way Michael had looked at his daughter, terrified and tender at all once, how Christina seemed so young, so overwhelmed, so grateful when Dorothy offered to stay and help those first few weeks. She thought about the Christmases when the kids were toddlers, chaotic and joyful, wrapping paper everywhere, cookies burned because everyone was too excited to pay attention to timers. Michael would make his terrible eggnog, too much nutmeg, never enough rum, and they'd all drink it anyway because it was tradition. She thought about last Christmas, how Christina seemed distracted, how Michael had spent most of Christmas morning on his laptop, apologizing but not stopping, how Emma had retreated to her room after lunch, and when Dorothy went to check on her, she'd been on her tablet, not playing with any of her new presents. Small things, easy to dismiss individually, but patterns if you paid attention. Dorothy pulled her needle through the fabric, silver thread catching light, stars taking shape, one stitch at a time. She wondered what her own mother would have done in this situation, but her mother had been dead for 20 years, and besides, her mother lived in a different era. Families stayed closer then, geographically and emotionally. Or maybe Dorothy was romanticizing. Maybe every generation thought they'd been closer, more connected, better at family than the one that followed. Her grandmother, though, the one who taught her to quilt, she would have understood this. She'd lived through her own children growing distant, making choices she didn't agree with, creating lives that didn't include much space for her. Dorothy remembered something her grandmother had said once near the end of her life. You can't stitch people together who want to pull apart, but you can keep making beautiful things and offering them. Sometimes that's enough. At the time, Dorothy had been young and didn't understand. Now, at 74, she was beginning to. She called Michael on a Thursday evening, timing it for after dinner but before the kids' bedtime. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone trying to sound more present than they felt. "Mom, hi. How are you?" "I'm well, sweetheart. How are you? How's Christina? How are the kids?" "Everyone's good. Busy, you know how it is." He sounded tired. "Did you get Christina's letter?" "I did." "I'm sorry about Christmas. I know you usually come for the week. It's just, things are complicated right now." "What things?" "Just work, life, the kids' schedules. Christina's overwhelmed. Michael's traveling more for work. It's not a good time for a long visit." Dorothy threaded her needle carefully. She was still working on Emma's quilt, phone tucked against her shoulder. "I understand. Christmas Day will be lovely." "Yeah?" He sounded surprised, maybe relieved. "You're sure you're okay with it?" "Of course." She pulled the thread through, gentle and steady. "I do have a question, though." "What's that?" "The quilts. I'm working on this year's quilts for Emma and Joshua. Should I still plan to bring them, or would you prefer I mail them?" There was a pause. Not long, maybe 3 seconds, but long enough that Dorothy noticed. "The quilts, right. Mom, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you—" He stopped, started again. "Do you think maybe the kids are getting too old for quilts? Emma's 10. She's into her phone and her friends. Joshua's more interested in video games than anything else. I just wonder if maybe—" He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Dorothy kept stitching. "You think the quilts are a waste of time?" "No, God, no. Mom, they're beautiful. You put so much work into them, but I'm not sure the kids really, they don't use them. Emma's is still folded at the bottom of her closet. Joshua's is somewhere, I'm not even sure where. And I just thought maybe you could spend your time on something they'd appreciate more." "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." Another pause, longer this time. Dorothy could hear sounds in the background, television, someone asking a question, Michael's muffled response to someone else. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "That came out wrong. The quilts are amazing. You know I love them. I still have mine from when I was a kid, but things are different now. Kids are different." "I know." "So you understand?" Dorothy looked at Emma's quilt, the constellation taking shape under her hands, all those stories woven into fabric and thread, stories that Emma might not care about now, but might remember later, might find meaning in some day when she was older and looking back at who she'd been, or might not. That was always the risk. "I understand," Dorothy said, and I'll see you Christmas Day." "Thanks, Mom. Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart." She hung up and sat in the quiet of her quilting room, the phone still in her hand, the needles still threaded with silver. Then she went back to work. Dorothy had been married for 38 years before her husband died. Cancer, the slow kind that gave you time to say goodbye, but not enough time to accept it. He'd been gone for 8 years now, and she still reached for him sometimes in the night, still turned to tell him something before remembering. They'd raised 3 sons. Michael was the youngest, the one who'd always been most like her, quiet, thoughtful, more comfortable with things than with words. Her older sons had moved far away, one to Texas, one to Colorado, and called on birthdays and holidays, but not much in between. That was fine. They had their lives, she had hers. Michael had stayed relatively close. Boston to Portland was a flight, not a drive, but it was manageable. She'd been grateful for that proximity, especially after her husband died. Grateful that she could see her grandchildren more than once a year. Grateful that Michael and Christina seemed to welcome her involvement in their lives. But she'd noticed the shift over the past 2 years. The visits getting shorter, the phone calls less frequent, Christina's carefully polite emails replacing what used to be actual conversations. Michael's distraction when they did talk, like his attention was always partly somewhere else. She told herself it was natural. Families evolved. Children grew up. Everyone got busier. You couldn't expect to maintain the same level of closeness forever. But the letter about Christmas and then Michael's comment about the quilts, those felt different, less like natural evolution and more like intentional distance. Dorothy tried to examine her own role in this without defensiveness. Had she been overbearing? Too involved? She didn't think so, but everyone is blind to their own failings. Had she criticized Christina's parenting or Michael's choices? Not intentionally, but perhaps something had come across wrong. She went through her memories carefully, looking for the moment things had shifted, but there was no single moment, just a gradual cooling, like water that goes from warm to lukewarm to cold so slowly you don't notice until you're already shivering. She finished Emma's quilt on a rainy afternoon in mid-November, the last stitch pulled through, knot tied off, thread snipped clean. She spread it across her work table to examine the whole, all those stars and constellations, the stories connecting them, the careful work that had taken 43 hours total, though she still wasn't counting. It was beautiful, even if Emma never used it, never cared about it, never understood the thought and love that went into every stitch. It was still beautiful. That meant something. Not everything, but something. She folded it carefully and set it aside, started Joshua's baseball quilt. But her hands felt heavier now. The joy had leaked out of the work somehow. She was still doing it. Muscle memory carried her through the familiar motions, but the meaning had shifted. She was making something no one wanted, offering love in a language no one was bothering to learn anymore. Dorothy had learned a lot of hard lessons over 74 years. She'd learned that marriages required constant tending, that children grew into people you didn't always recognize, that death came for everyone eventually, polite or not, that bodies betrayed you, that time moved faster the less of it you had left. But this lesson, that you could love people who no longer had room for you, this one still stung. Thanksgiving came and went. Dorothy spent it with neighbors, a nice couple in their 60s who hosted an open house every year for people with nowhere else to go. It was pleasant. The food was good. The conversation was friendly. She brought a pie and left feeling grateful for community, even if it wasn't family. Michael called that evening. Thanksgiving dinner in Boston was chaotic, he said. Christina's parents were there, and her brother with his family, and everyone had too many opinions about everything. He sounded exhausted. Dorothy listened and made sympathetic sounds and didn't mention that she would have liked to have been invited to that chaos. December arrived. The rain turned colder, sharper. Dorothy finished Joshua's quilt, baseball diamonds stitched in perfect geometry, tiny baseball players frozen in mid-swing,
the whole thing radiating energy and movement, all that boyish enthusiasm captured in fabric and thread. She folded both quilts and wrapped them carefully, wrote cards, one for each grandchild. She thought about what to say. Everything sounded either too much or too little. Finally, she kept it simple. Made with love, Merry Christmas, Grandma Dorothy. She bought her plane ticket for Christmas Day, morning flight out, evening flight back. 8 hours in Boston total, enough time for presents and dinner and some conversation, not enough time for anything deep, but perhaps that was the point. The night before her flight, Dorothy sat in her quilting room with a cup of tea and looked at the fabric she'd already collected for next year, scraps and pieces, waiting to be transformed.
She'd been gathering them throughout the fall. Colors Emma had mentioned liking, patterns that reminded her of Joshua's interests. She wondered if she should bother. The question sat in her chest, heavy and uncomfortable. Was continuing to make quilts an act of love or an act of denial? Was she honoring her relationship with her grandchildren or forcing connection they didn't want? Dorothy had learned that the hardest questions rarely had clear answers. Christmas morning in Boston was cold and bright. Michael picked her up from the airport with an apologetic smile and explanations about traffic. He looked older than he had in photos, more gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. They made small talk during the drive. Weather, flights, work, surface things that required no vulnerability. The house was decorated beautifully. Christina had always had good taste. Lights on the tree, garland on the banister, the smell of something cinnamon baking. Emma and Joshua were still in pajamas, on their devices, barely looking up when Dorothy walked in. "Kids," Michael said with forced brightness, "Grandma's here." Emma glanced up. "Hi, Grandma," then back to her phone. Joshua offered a distracted wave. Christina emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "Dorothy, Merry Christmas. Let me take your coat." The day unfolded with that particular awkwardness of forced family time. Presents were opened, Dorothy's quilts received polite thanks and were immediately set aside. Christina's parents arrived and dominated the conversation. Michael split his attention between guests and his phone. Emma disappeared to her room. Joshua played video games. Dorothy helped where she could, setting the table, washing dishes, entertaining Christina's mother with stories that required nothing of her hosts. She was good at this, making herself useful without being intrusive, fitting into spaces without requiring them to expand. But she noticed things, small details that accumulated into understanding. Michael and Christina barely spoke to each other except to coordinate logistics. When they did speak, there was an edge, not quite hostile, but not warm either. Emma seemed tired, not just sleepy, but exhausted in a deeper way, the kind that came from carrying stress too heavy for 10-year-old shoulders. Joshua was loud and energetic in the way kids sometimes were when they were trying to fill uncomfortable silences. Christina's smile never reached her eyes. And Dorothy's quilts, those quilts she'd spent months creating, sat unopened in their wrapping, forgotten in a corner while everyone focused on electronics and gift cards and things that required no thought to give or receive. She didn't say anything. She smiled and helped and participated and tried not to take up too much space. When her car arrived to take her back to the airport, the goodbyes were quick. Hugs that didn't quite connect. Promises to talk soon that everyone knew were empty. On the plane home, Dorothy closed her eyes and tried not to cry. January was always quiet. The decorations came down, the gray sky pressed close, the days were short and the nights were long, and everything felt like waiting. Dorothy returned to her quilting room, but found that she couldn't work. The fabric looked flat. The colors seemed wrong. Her hands, usually so sure, felt clumsy and uncertain.
She'd spent Christmas Day with her family and somehow felt lonelier than if she'd stayed home. That was the thing no one told you about aging. Loneliness wasn't about being alone. It was about being with people who didn't really see you, being present but not mattering, taking up space without being invited into it. Dorothy had always prided herself on not being the kind of mother who demanded attention, who guilt-tripped her children or made passive-aggressive comments about how long it had been since they called. She gave space. She respected boundaries. She tried to be the kind of parent adult children actually wanted to maintain relationships with. But maybe she'd given too much space. Maybe respect had become invisibility. Or, and this was the thought she kept trying not to think, maybe it didn't matter what she did. Maybe Michael and Christina and the kids were building a life that just didn't have room for her regardless of how she showed up. She sat in her quilting room through the short January days and tried to figure out what to do with that possibility. The answer came from an unexpected place. Dorothy volunteered at a local community center 2 afternoons a week, teaching quilting to anyone interested. The classes were free, open to all ages and skill levels. Most participants were older women like herself, but occasionally younger people wandered in. In late January, Sarah started attending. Mid-30s, pregnant, hands that didn't know how to hold a needle but were willing to learn. Sarah was quiet at first, focused on her work, but gradually, over several weeks, she started talking about her pregnancy, about her fears, about her own mother who lived across the country and too ill to travel, about how scared she was to become a parent without her mother nearby to guide her. "Keep thinking about all the things I don't know," Sarah said one afternoon, struggling with a particularly difficult corner. "All the questions I'll have, and my mom won't be there to answer them." Dorothy guided her hands, showing her the technique. "You'll figure it out." That's what everyone says, but I don't want to figure it out. I want someone who's been through it to help me, to show me I'm not going to mess everything up. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Is that stupid?" "No, sweetheart, that's human." They worked in silence for a while. Then Sarah said quietly, I know this is strange, but would you maybe want to get coffee sometime outside of class? I could use someone to talk to, someone who's been through this." Dorothy felt something crack open in her chest, not breaking exactly, opening. "I'd like that very much." They started meeting weekly, coffee at a cafe near the community center. Sarah would ask questions about pregnancy, birth, babies, parenting. Dorothy would answer what she could, share stories from raising her own sons, offer reassurance that feeling overwhelmed was normal. But something else happened too. Sarah asked about Dorothy's life, about her late husband, about quilting, about what it was like to raise children decades ago versus now, about whether Dorothy had regrets. And Dorothy, who'd spent months feeling invisible, found herself being seen. Sarah's baby was born in early March, a girl, healthy and loud and perfect. Dorothy visited the hospital with a quilt she'd made during those gray January weeks, soft flannel and pastel colors, simple pattern, edges bound with care. Sarah cried when she saw it. "This is too much. You didn't have to." "I wanted to."
Sarah held the quilt against her daughter's tiny body. "It's perfect. She's going to love this. I'm going to tell her, when she's older, about the woman who made it for her, about how kind you were to her mom when her mom was scared and alone." Dorothy felt tears prick her own eyes. "You weren't alone." "I know, because of you." She stayed for an hour, held the baby, so small, so new, so full of unwritten future, showed Sarah how to swaddle properly, how to support the head, the small practical things that made early parenthood less terrifying. When she left, her husband caught her in the hallway. "Thank you," he said, seriously. Sarah's been so much calmer since she met you, more confident. You've been like family to her. Like family. The words followed Dorothy home and settled into her bones. She thought about that phrase for days, weeks, like family. What made someone family? Biology? Obligation? Proximity? History? Or was it something else? Something about showing up, about seeing and being seen, about offering what you had and receiving what was offered, about choice, not just circumstance. Dorothy had been operating under the assumption that family was fixed, that Michael and Christina and Emma and Joshua were her people full stop, and if they pulled away, she'd somehow failed. But maybe family was more fluid than that. Maybe it expanded and contracted. Maybe you could love people who didn't have room for you and still find room in your life for people who did. She wasn't replacing her son or her grandchildren, but maybe she was learning that love had more capacity than she'd realized, that there were different kinds of family, that mattering to someone, anyone, was its own form of richness. Sarah called frequently those first weeks, panicked questions about feeding and sleeping and inexplicable baby crying. Dorothy answered when she could, reassured, reminded Sarah that she was doing fine, that all parents felt this overwhelmed, that it got easier. She started making another quilt, not for Emma or Joshua this time, for Sarah's daughter, a small quilt, crib-sized, in colors Sarah had mentioned liking. She worked on it in the evenings, her hands remembering their purpose, the joy returning slowly to the process. Michael called in April. "Mom, I owe you an apology." Dorothy set down her needle. "For what?" "For Christmas, for cutting your visit short, for—" He paused. "For a lot of things, actually. I've been thinking about it, about how we've been treating you. It wasn't right." "Michael?" "No, let me finish. Christina and we've been having problems, for a while now. We're working on it, couples therapy, actually. And one of the things that came up is how we've been handling stress. We've been pulling inward, shutting people out, including you, especially you." Dorothy waited. She'd learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was just listen. "I know the quilts matter to you. I know they're not just quilts. They're you, your time, your love, your attention to who the kids are. And I dismissed that. I made it sound like it was worthless. I'm sorry. I understand you were overwhelmed. That's not an excuse. Mom, you're amazing. You show up. You pay attention. You remember things about the kids that I forget. And instead of appreciating that, I pushed you away because it was easier than dealing with my own stuff." His voice got rough. "I don't want to be the kind of son who takes his mother for granted." Dorothy felt her throat tighten. "You're not. You're stressed. You're trying to hold everything together. That's not taking me for granted. That's just being human." "Maybe, but I want to do better. Christina does too. We'd like you to come visit this summer, for a real visit, a week like you used to, if you're willing." "Of course I'm willing." "Yeah?" He sounded relieved, almost young again. "Okay, good. And Mom, Emma asked about her quilt the other day. She pulled it out and put it on her bed, said it was beautiful. I think she's starting to understand what they mean." Dorothy looked at the quilt spread across her work table, Sarah's daughter's quilt, nearly finished. "People understand things when they're ready." "Yeah, I guess they do." The summer visit was different, calmer, more honest. Michael and Christina were clearly working on their relationship. You could see it in how they communicated, how they made space for each other.
Emma had indeed put her constellation quilt on her bed and wanted to hear about the mythology behind each star. Joshua showed Dorothy his baseball card collection with genuine enthusiasm. It wasn't perfect. There were still stresses and tensions and moments of disconnection, but there was also effort, presence, room for Dorothy to be grandmother without having to shrink herself to fit. She returned home in late July with a lightness she hadn't felt in months. And she continued visiting Sarah and the baby, continued attending quilting classes at the community center, continued building this other form of family, the chosen kind, based on need and care rather than obligation. In September, Sarah asked Dorothy to be Sarah's daughter's godmother. Not in a religious sense necessarily, more like someone who'll be there for her, someone who'll care about her, who'll tell her stories about where she came from and who her mom was when she was young, someone who'll matter in her life. Dorothy accepted. Of course she accepted. October arrived again, 1 year since the letter. Dorothy sat in her quilting room with her morning coffee, watching the light shift across her work table, and thought about how much had changed. She was working on this year's Christmas quilts. Emma had requested something with books and libraries. She'd joined a book club at school. Joshua wanted space themes, rockets and planets and astronauts. Dorothy had collected fabric throughout the summer, planned the designs, started piecing. But she was also working on a quilt for Sarah's daughter's first birthday, and a quilt for a woman at the community center whose granddaughter was getting married, and a small wall hanging for her neighbor who'd mentioned she'd always wanted something handmade for her entry hall. Her quilting room had always been a place of love and intention, but now it felt bigger somehow, less focused on one family, one set of grandchildren, one definition of connection. She'd learned something important this past year, something her grandmother had tried to tell her decades ago, but she hadn't been ready to hear. You can't force people to receive what you're offering, but you can keep offering, and sometimes you discover that other people are hungry for exactly what you have to give. Love wasn't a limited resource. Making a quilt for Sarah's daughter didn't mean she loved Emma or Joshua any less. Spending time with her quilting students didn't diminish her desire to spend time with her family. If anything, having multiple places to pour her care made her more capable of giving it freely, less desperate, less needy, more genuinely generous.
She finished Emma's quilt on a rainy afternoon in November. The last stitch pulled through, thread tied off, the whole thing spread across her table, libraries and books and reading nooks, all rendered in warm browns and deep greens and careful attention to detail. Emma would love it. Or maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she'd fold it away and forget about it for years until some future moment when she pulled it out and remembered being 10 and loving books and having a grandmother who paid attention. Either way, Dorothy had made something beautiful. She'd offered love in the language she knew best. That was enough. It had to be enough. It was enough. She thought about her own grandmother, dead now for more than 30 years, but still present in every stitch Dorothy made, still teaching her across all that time about what mattered and what endured. Love made visible, connection made tangible, small acts of care repeated over time until they became something larger than themselves. That was the gift of quilting, and maybe the gift of aging, too. You got to see patterns. You got to understand how small stitches accumulated into whole cloth. You got to know in your bones that nothing beautiful came quickly. Dorothy folded Emma's quilt carefully and set it aside. Then she pulled out the fabric for Joshua's space quilt and began to piece it together. Outside, the rain fell steady and soft.
Inside, her hands worked with practiced grace, turning scraps into something whole, something useful, something that told a story if you knew how to read it. She'd been doing this for 56 years. She'd do it as long as her hands still worked and her eyes could still see the stitches. Because this quiet act of making, this patient offering of love, this was what she had to give. And somewhere, someone would receive it. Someone would wrap themselves in what she'd made and feel warmer, feel seen, feel loved. That was the gift, not in the receiving, though that was lovely when it happened, but in the making itself, in the knowledge that your hands could still create beauty, that your time could still matter, that your love, however it was received, was still worth offering. Dorothy threaded her needle with silver thread, started stitching stars into dark blue fabric, building constellations stitch by stitch, story by story, one small choice at a time. She had learned over 74 years of living that some of the most important gifts are the ones you never mention giving. But she'd also learned that the act of giving itself, that quiet, repeated, patient offering, was its own reward. And maybe that was enough. It was enough.